The Honourable Member for Skeena, Bulkley Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll be dividing my time up with the member from Saskatoon University. My first speech in a House, and I'd like to thank all the supporters from Skeena, Bulkley Valley, and this does take me back to how I got started in politics in the first place. And it's ironic of sorts, because as a First Nations member in Kitimat, where I come from, I got my start on the environment file, meaning we were trying to repair the damage done to our territory over the last 70 years. Damage to the river, damage to the forest, damage to the air. So that took up the bulk of our time. And in that time, I had to research what an environmental assessment is, what a permit is, what Aboriginal rights and title is. This took me years. And as a laborer, at a time when the internet wasn't readily available to us, we had one computer in our condemned band office. It used to be a residential school. This was hard. It took years to understand this. And nobody in my organization could really explain to me the full extent of what an environmental assessment is. And now I'm back. And over the years, I used to think about all this information in my head being useless because I thought nobody cared and I couldn't use it anywhere. And then I end up here talking about the same things that I was talking about in 2003. But this time it's flipped. And I think Canadians should understand Bill C-5 is in two parts. One is about breaking down provincial boundaries. I will not be talking about that. I'll be talking about the second part, the exemption of environmental assessments in Canada. The environmental assessments are responsible for LNG Canada, the largest private investment in Canadian history, being built in Kitimat to the highest standards with transparency and accountability. Everybody understood what was going to happen, because there was federal authorities involved and provincial authorities involved, and more importantly, what strengthened that process was Aboriginal rights and title. All First Nations from Prince George to Kitimat were part of that process. We all got it, we understood it. And there was an emergency of sorts back then. There was a crisis. Aboriginals were in poverty, and the violence of poverty that goes along with that. Now we have a new crisis. But nobody on the government side is talking about some of the conditions that led to this crisis in the first place. Bill C-69, that extensive bill with all those words in it that actually shut down the building of pipelines. Bill C-48, no tanker, the ban on tankers coming off the west coast of British Columbia. The weakened state that we're in, and the reason why Bill C-5 is on the floor in the first place, is because of tariffs. But I'll go further to say, Canada has lost its place in the geoenergy world, the geopolitical world, and the geoeconomics world. And it was all self-inflicted. I mean, forget about the tariffs for a second and just think, without a strong economy, you got a weak country. That's just basic, simple math. That's just common sense. First Nations understand this. And now we're talking about Bill C-5 that will basically exempt environmental assessment from major projects at the federal level. It won't reduce it or eliminate it at the provincial level. That's yet to be seen, how much time will be reduced. There's no word on how the federal government will actually replace the consultation and accommodation of Aboriginal rights and title that's protected by Section 35 of the Constitution. And these processes have been in place in the formation over decades. And now on one day, we're going to wipe that all out. We're going to say, no, we don't need environmental assessment. I agree, environmental assessments take a lot of money, they take a lot of time, and they're risky. You could do all the work you can and still not receive an environmental assessment certificate. Not to mention what will happen if you have a harmonized environmental assessment with the provinces. So many different ways to say yes and no, and now you're getting that from BC that will say no to pipelines. So what we're talking about here is almost a waste of time. If you do, by some miracle, get to a point where, yes, you do get an approval on a pipeline, you're going to end up in court. Because there's a tremendous amount of gaps that are proposed by this bill. Gaps that were in place back when I started as council in 2003. Back when not only were we trying to figure out how do we make our way in a new world as First Nations, but how do we strengthen the environmental standards in BC and Canada? How do we get BC and Canada to actually live up to the conditions in a permit? That took a lot of work. So when you hear First Nations saying that they strengthened the permitting regulations, they strengthened the environmental assessment, and they used the rights and title to do it, that cost First Nations a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of political capital, because you're trying to balance economics with the environment and the welfare of your people for the next 50, 100, 150 years. Difficult. But in Kitimat Village, we reached a happy medium where everybody benefited, not just First Nations. Even First Nations, our neighboring First Nations, benefited. But it was on a basis of processes in the province of British Columbia and Canada. We figured it out. Yes, environmental assessments cost money, incredible amount of money. For a major project, I recommend to proponents, you'd better have $50 million of disposable money just to get your certificate. And that's no guarantee that you're going to get your certificate. But Bill C-5 is now saying, we will forego an environmental assessment, we'll give you an exemption, if politically it's acceptable to government. That will cut down time and it will cut down money. But how many groups will now be lobbying the government to get on that exemption list? How will government ensure that that lobbying is done openly, transparently, and fairly? We're just going through one of the debates already about contracts that were issued to a company to the tune of 60 million plus, where processes were in place to ensure there was no fraud or corruption in these contracts being issued. We still haven't got resolve on that. What are you going to do when a $30 billion project comes through the pipes, the pipeline, or a $40 billion project? None of this is actually making any sense to me, except for the fact that there will be no environmental assessment for a major project. Unless, the way I saw it, you find ways to cut corners. And where are you going to cut corners? You're already going to do it with the environmental assessment, but surely you're not going to cut corners with Aboriginals on Aboriginal rights and title, consultation, and accommodation. Now, there's a lot of First Nations that understand these processes, but number one, First Nations in our area, we address the environment first. That's what we do. And we use our rights and title to do that. We understand there's jobs. We understand there's money, training. There's everything that comes with a project that's associated. But you have to address the environment first. And the best way to do it is to engage in environmental assessment. Now, usually, Aboriginal rights and title run parallel to environmental assessment, both provincially and federally. But if there's no environmental assessment, then what is the process? How will Aboriginals ensure that projects are done to the highest standards? We've always bragged, Canada, we have the highest environmental standards in the world. How do you ensure that with Bill C-5 going forward? There's many questions here, but the Liberal government actually just proposed closure, meaning we will not get to debate this in full. This got tabled last week. I have never come across a bill this extensive, and we only have a week to debate it. Not everybody's going to get up and get a chance to talk on behalf of their riding. And Canada, you've got to hold this government accountable. You've got to know what's happening with Bill C-5 in the future for the next 5, 10, 20 years, because exemptions, they're going to be a big issue.